Suppose I was going to tell you that today we're going to cook some of the world's favorite dishes. Hopefully I've got your attention because today we're going to be frying. Imagine for just a second a donut that just came out of the fryer, it's been glazed, or fish and chips with a cold pint of beer. All that and more is what we're going to learn about today. Now, frying is a dry heat cooking technique with fat, and we've already practiced one of those. We sautéed earlier. But the thing that makes what we're doing today different is we're going to use a larger amount of oil. It's as simple as that. Sauté uses a small amount of oil, pan frying and deep fat frying use a much larger amount of oil. To begin with, let's talk about the nature of fat one more time. You've already learned that every fat has its own smoke point, which is where it begins to break down. When we're frying, it's important to us that we have a fat that is stable and resists high temperature over time. Now, there's a couple of different things that will make fat break down. First and foremost, heat. So we want to keep the heat under control, but we want to choose an oil that has the tolerance for heat that makes it a good candidate. When I think about oils that I might like to fry in, things like cottonseed oil come to mind. Peanut oil is very good for frying. Even low-grade olive oil is good for frying. Canola oil is good for frying. In a restaurant setting, they use a different type of fat. They have a fat that's been engineered to withstand heat over a long period of time. They do it through the process of hydrogenation, and hydrogenation leads to trans fats, so I'm not going to suggest we even go there today. We've got some choices when it comes to equipment for frying. If you are lucky enough to have a little countertop deep fat fryer, by all means use it. I've got one, but we're not going to use it today because for many of you, you won't have that at home. Instead, I've got a pan like this one right here with oil already in place. If you'll notice, the oil is only halfway up. Don't ever fill a pot that you're frying in any fuller than halfway, because as you fry, the oil will seethe up. We also need all the rest of our equipment. So we need a place to drain things that have been fried. We need tools like this to manipulate the food once it's in the fat. I've got everything laid out here, and as we progress, you'll see exactly what's needed. I've also got a hood above the stove which will draw air up and away. If you have this at home, likely you've got a hood as well. Just make sure that it's turned on. Now, it would be a mistake for us to launch into an exercise on frying without stopping for a second and considering safety. If you put a pan of oil on the heat, don't leave it in the kitchen. Don't leave it unattended. If you do, what can happen is the temperature in the oil will rise. You'll get to the smoke point. If you're not there to turn it down, a little bit later, you'll find yourself at the flash point where it bursts spontaneously into flame. And I don't want that to happen. So here's what I'm going to recommend. Don't leave the kitchen once the oil is on the stove and turned on. And if you see it smoke, you know that the temperature is getting too hot. In the off chance that you have some sort of a fire, it's a simple thing. Turn the burner off, take a lid, put it on top, and what that will do is it will starve the fire of oxygen. That's all you need to know. I can't imagine you'll have that problem, but I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it up front. What we're going to cook today is a veal cutlet, and we're going to cook it in a shallow pan like this, a sautoir, and the cooking technique is going to be called pan frying. Now, just the same way that when we sautéed earlier, we needed to begin with tender foods, this is a high heat cooking technique that will not make food tender. So we have no choice but to start with tender foods. Let me show you what I'm going to do here. I've got a piece of veal, and to make it tender, what I want to do is pound it out. And pounding will break any of the fibers in there, make it thin, make it broad, and make it tender. So let's get started here. I'm going to take this, and with a knife, I'm going to butterfly it open, just like that. And then I'm going to put another piece of paper on the top of it, take my mallet, And it's as simple as that. Now, if you want to evaluate this to see if it's actually tender, you can take your thumb and forefinger and press on it. And if you can press your finger and thumb right through the meat, it's tender enough to progress. All right, I'm going to season this with a little bit of salt and pepper. And I'm going to do that on both sides. And we'll move ahead. What I have laid out here in front is what I would call a standard breading. We start over here with flour, and then we've got beaten egg with a little bit of water in it, and then finally dried breadcrumbs. This standard breading will coat this piece of meat, which on its own doesn't have a tremendous amount of flavor, and it will protect the meat from the heat of the oil, but it will also protect the oil from the moisture in the meat. If you ever have a pan of hot oil and you put a little bit of water in there, it becomes almost explosive. It pops and it spits, and that's not what we want. So all of the moisture in this meat is trapped inside the breading. That's good news for us. Here's what this process looks like. I'm going to go first into the flour and hit it on both sides with flour, and then pat off all the excess. Just enough to coat it like that. And then I go right into the egg and make sure it's coated on both sides. And then finally into the breadcrumbs. I worked for a chef once that said that this is far and away the best way to cook a piece of meat because all of the juices and the flavor of the meat are actually trapped inside the breading. And I think I tend to believe that. So this is ready to cook right now. I have a pan on the heat, and it's hot already. We're going to choose an appropriate oil, and what I'm going to be using is canola oil. It has a relatively high smoke point, and so I'm going to put oil in the pan. Now, you ask yourself, how much? Well, I want enough oil so that it comes about a third of the way up the side. Any more than that, and I run the risk of the oil sort of spilling over the top of the veal cutlet and soaking the breadcrumbs on top and making it a little bit oily. Okay? So, how do we evaluate temperature here? It's not really deep enough for me to put a thermometer in, but if you take a little bit of a breadcrumb and throw it in, if it sizzles right away, that means that the temperature is at least 212 degrees, and if it browns within about a minute, then what you're looking at is a temperature closer to 350 degrees. If you see smoke coming out of the pan, then you know you've reached the smoke point of that oil, and you should pay attention and turn the temperature down. You can also, at that point, simply add the food, and the addition of the food will bring the temperature down. If you look, this breadcrumb is just starting to brown. It's been in there now for about 30 seconds. So I think we are just about ready to go. I'll take that out, discard it. Be a little bit careful to put this into the pan away from yourself so that you don't burn yourself. So, as I look at this cooking, I'm paying attention so that I don't see too much smoke. If I do, turn the temperature down a little bit. I also want to make sure that there's not too much oil, and this oil comes about a third of the way up the sides. And then I can monitor its progress just by picking it up and checking it every now and then. You can see already we're getting a little bit of browning. This piece of meat is probably no more than 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick. So if it takes any longer than 2 minutes, I'd be surprised. It goes very, very quickly. At this point, I've got a nice golden color on the first side, and so I'm going to flip the whole thing over. The pan has recovered the initial loss of temperature, so now I can even turn the heat down a little bit more. But listen for that sizzle. That tells you that the pan is hot. Look for the smoke. that tells you when the pan is too hot. So I would say we're about 10 seconds away from this being done. When it comes out, the bread will have absorbed a little bit of oil, but not too much, less than you would think. The moisture in that bread will actually force the fat away from this product, not really absorb it. I'm looking for a good color on the second side. And ideally, I get perfect color top and bottom. But I'd be silly to take the bad side and show it to the person I was eating or inviting to eat with me. All right, I'm going to take that out and set it aside. This pan should come off the heat, otherwise that fat will continue to cook. I'll turn the burner off, and we'll allow this to sit for just a second, and the fat can drain off of it. It'll be absorbed by the paper towel. Now, I like this first side the best, and so I'm going to take that and put it right onto the plate. We've worked pretty hard to create a nice, crusty, golden browned finish on this veal cutlet. It would be a mistake to take a really wet sauce and put it over the top, and everything that was crisp and golden is now soggy. And so we're looking for a pretty simple garniture, something that could be as simple as this. I'm going to grab some capers that I've wrapped in anchovy fillets. This is a little garnish that I love. And I'm going to take some parsley leaves, just gather them up and cut them very, very coarsely, and sprinkle those on the top. And then finally, a little bit of lemon. And when somebody comes to eat this, what they would do is they would pick up the lemon and squeeze it on at the last possible minute so it stays nice and crispy. So that's pan frying in a nutshell. Start to finish, it took us about 5 minutes, and we have a beautiful example of a veal cutlet with a nice golden crust. Next, we're going to move on to fish and chips. Okay, we have pan frying behind us at this point, and we're going to move on to deep fat frying. You can see the pan of oil here on the stove. This is canola oil, and the pan is no more than halfway full. That's really important because as we put food in there, it will bubble and seethe, and you run the risk of oil spilling out onto the stovetop. We're going to make fish and chips, and what I'm going to start with is the potatoes. We've got some work to do here. So first I'm going to get these cut up. We'll sort of square it off. Maybe not have it too perfect. And so that these don't discolor, I'm going to put them right into water. This will keep them from discoloring. It will also wash some of the surface starch off of the outside of the potato, and they'll brown more nicely because of that. These potatoes can be stored in this water overnight if you like. It's not a problem. But they do need to be kept in water, otherwise they'll discolor. I have some here that I cut earlier. They've been soaked in water, and I took them out and blotted them dry. It's important to do that because if you add water into hot fat, you get sort of an explosive reaction. Now, a quick word about these potatoes. Potatoes, if you were to taste it raw, are not very tender. They don't taste very good raw. They're pretty tough, in fact. And if we put them into hot fat, what you can expect is that they will brown before they get tender. And so we're going to cook these in a two-stage method. First, we'll cook them at a lower temperature, down around 300 degrees, and allow them to get tender all the way through. Then we'll take them out and drain them, at which point they won't turn color any longer because the enzymes that make them turn color have all been destroyed by the heat. Then we'll turn up the heat on the oil and bring it from 300 up to about 375. And then we'll put these back in and they'll get brown, golden, and crisp just like that. Let's get started here. Now, one last thought. If you go to a restaurant and look at how they do their deep frying, they usually have a basket, and that basket is really handy for dealing with a lot of different things. That's the basket method of frying. A basket is a problem if you have something that's too large for the basket. The basket is also a problem if you have something dipped in batter, because the batter can adhere itself to the basket. So basket method is one distinct technique, and swimming another. And we're going to just practice swimming right on through. Put these things gently into the oil so you don't splash hot fat everywhere. There's sort of a satisfying murmur to things that are frying in hot oil. The temperature is down right around 300 degrees, which is almost ideal. We don't want to brown these. What we're interested in is making sure that these get tender. There's a clue that I use, and the clue is simply this, that when I take them out and shake them, they rustle a little bit. It's a little bit tougher to do when you don't have a basket, but it's a good rule of thumb. For you at home, you can just take one out, drain it, break it open, and taste it. And if it's tender, you're good to move on. This probably takes a minute to a minute and a half. Okay, at this point, the temperature's dropped a little bit below 300, but I think they're done. They kind of rustle when I shake them around, and I'm going to take them out and just drain them on an absorbent towel. You can do this well in advance. This could happen even yesterday, and you could finish them up the next day. If you want to evaluate them, you can take a French fry and break it and see how it breaks. It's nice and tender. This has been cooked all the way already. It's just below 300 degrees now, so what I'm going to need to do is allow this to heat and come up back to frying temperatures, which is right around 360, 375. We're going to make good use of this time by putting together a little bit of a beer batter to fry some fish in. What I have here is all-purpose flour, and I'm going to measure into that all-purpose flour about a half a teaspoon of salt, and I'm going to measure in about a quarter of a teaspoon worth of baking powder, and I'm going to stir those things together. And then I'm going to take and I'm going to add an egg yolk to that, but I want to hold on to the whites. And don't allow any of the yolk to get into the white, because we're going to whip these whites until they're nice and frothy. And any yolk, any fat in there will be a problem. So that goes in. We'll set this aside right now. And I've got about 8 ounces of cold beer. And I'm going to start and break up that yolk, and little by little add more beer and drag more and more of the flour into this mix. You want to break up any lumps as you go, but don't over-mix it. You can run into a problem with this getting glutinous, sort of ropey and tough, and that's not what you want at all. So only mix it enough to get the lumps out and get it smooth. And after that, step away from the bowl. Even if you're careful not to mix this too much, it's a good idea to take this mixture and set it aside for, let's say, a half an hour, 45 minutes, and let it rest. The gluten in the flour will begin to relax, and this will become a lot more tender. So what I have here is a batter that I made a little bit earlier. It's already had a chance to relax. I'm going to wash this whip off very quickly, and then we'll whip some egg whites and add it into this batter. So here's our egg white. We want to whip this until it's nice and frothy. And it should go pretty quick. It's only 1 egg white after all. When you're whipping an egg white like this, it'll probably quadruple in volume, if not more than that. So initially it was pretty hard to get purchase on it, but as it starts to loosen up, it turns stiffer and stiffer. I want this to hold moist peaks, and you'll see what that means in just a second. So you can see, as I pull this up, it holds a very soft peak that is still shiny and moist. That's exactly what I want. You don't want to whip it so much that it gets dry, because if you do, it won't fold in effectively. Now, we spent some time whipping air into that, so it's important not to stir all that air out. So I'm going to introduce this egg white whipped into the batter. And when you fold, you cut down through the middle and come up on the outside. And gently fold the two of these things together until it's homogeneous. And once it's homogeneous, step away from the bowl. You don't want to over-manipulate this. When you see streaks of egg white, you're almost done. And that's it. It doesn't take more than that. Let's have a look at the temperature of our oil. Right now, we're at about 375 degrees, which is ideal. And so we're going to take our blanched French fries and put them back into hot oil. At this point, it should go pretty quickly. Already you can see the French fries beginning to brown. Start to finish, I would anticipate this is going to take no more than about a minute and a half. So a minute and a half worth of blanching at a lower temperature, right around 300 degrees, and another minute and a half worth of final cooking at a temperature around 375 degrees. While we're waiting here, I just want to tell you that you can't overload this pan with too much food, because as you add cold food to the oil, the temperature will drop, and at some point you'll reach a point where the heat coming from the stove can no longer keep up with what you're asking of it on the top. It can't recover its temperature. So you've got a sense here of what I'm doing. If it takes significantly longer than a minute and a half to finish these things up, you're trying to fry too much at once. You can also check the temperature. It's holding pretty steady at 375 degrees, which means to me that this pan is able to recover heat. Now take a look. These things are a nice golden. I'm going to give them just a little bit more color because that's my personal preference. And then while they're still hot and a little bit wet with oil, I'm going to season them with salt, and we'll set them aside and keep them warm so that we can fry some fish. Here we go. All right, we'll set those aside. We have our beer batter all ready to go, and our fish likewise. This is lingcod. I cut it into pieces that are not too large, maybe twice the size of my thumb, something like that. Too big and they take too long to cook, and because we've got the oil as hot as we do, that can be a problem. It burns on the outside before it cooks all the way through. This should not be too wet. This fish is pretty nice and dry, and we're going to come and dip it into this batter. Make sure it's completely coated, and then be a little bit careful to let the excess drip off and ease it into the hot oil. Don't dip your fingers into the hot oil. Again, let the excess drip off and then ease it into the hot oil, and we'll go ahead and cook all 4 pieces. It's worth saying that if you're going to the trouble of frying fish like this, you want to have everything ready before the fish goes into the oil. Your table should be set. The beer should be cold. Everybody should be waiting for the food. The food should not be waiting for people. That's the nature of fried food. We'll see how our fish is coming along here. It looks great. Now, a lot of people say that I don't like fried fish in batter because it's greasy. What I would tell you is that if the fat is hot enough, when you put it into the hot fat, there is an explosive reaction where the moisture turns immediately into steam and it actually pushes the fat away from what it is that you're cooking. It actually prevents what you're cooking from absorbing oil. The only problem you'll have is if your fat is not hot enough to make that happen. So 375 degrees is kind of a magic number. The smoke point of canola oil is probably 450 degrees, so we've got a lot of wiggle room there. This is getting close. Okay, here is what we're going to serve our fish and chips in. We've got a basket with a nice piece of paper in the bottom. Traditionally, this would be the newspaper. So you take the San Francisco Chronicle, and that's it. Maybe the Washington Post. It's time for us to look in on our fish. It's close. You may discover you need to turn it every now and then. If there is one side that's pale, it just needs to be turned. While we're waiting for the fish, I'm going to take the French fries and stack them into the bottom. I'll turn the fat off. Don't get so excited about your fried fish that you leave the fat going. Turn the temperature off, turn the heat off, and then take your food out. It's probably not a bad idea to gather up any little bits and pieces of batter or potato that start to collect in the bottom or in the fat. This will just continue to burn if you leave it in there. So I'm going to take it and discard that. And we'll bring our fish over here and stack it right in with our French fries. And I'm going to put just a few herbs on here. And that's it. Fish and chips. You are sure to be a hit at the cottage this summer. If you know how to do this, you can do it outside, you can do it inside. Take your thermometer with you, and you're ready to go. Now, before we leave frying, I want to show you what I think of as an anomaly. It's frying things that have so much sugar that we can't cook them at a high temperature like 375 degrees. So when we come back, we're going to get mixed up in frying parsnips. Okay, take a look at what I've got here. A humble parsnip and a really terrific bar snack. I'm going to show you how to make these very, very quickly. And the reason I'm going to show you the technique is that parsnips are a problem when you get mixed up in frying. They are so sweet that if we fry at 375 degrees, they will burn long before they ever get crispy and crunchy like this. So let me set these aside, and I'll show you the technique. I have peeled parsnip right here, and I'm going to slice it very, very thin on what I call a mandolin. It's tasted blood before, so I want to be a little bit careful. And I want to slice them as thin as I can get them and have them uniform and not falling apart. All right. Having sliced these, I'm going to gather them all up, and they go right into the oil, and this is right at about 300 degrees. Now, you'll get some clues right out of the chute, and the clues are these. We see some bubbling, so it's got to be at least more than 212 where things boil. I want to separate them so they don't stick together and they can fry evenly. And I'm going to look at the temperature now and see where we're at. And it's dropped down to about 285, 290 degrees, which is just about where I want it to be. I think we're just about ready. Let's check the oil and see how things are working out. If you look in the pot, These are already starting to turn golden, but most significant is the fact that there's no bubbling going on. So I can start to pull these out of here. This is where, if you had a basket fryer, it might be a handy thing because you could pull it out all at once. But typically at home, people won't have that. While they're still a little bit hot and wet with oil, I'm going to season them with salt. And then I'm going to take them and put them into a bowl, along with these that I fried earlier. And I've got some cheese. This is Parmesan cheese that's been shaved kind of thin. I'm going to break it. Probably wouldn't even hurt for this to go on while they're still a little bit warm, and the cheese will get soft and maybe stick. And it's time to gather them up and put them right into a bowl. I like to think of these like little haystacks. And there's nothing much more exciting in this world than a cold beer and fried parsnips. A little bit of parsley on top. All right, there you have it. Maybe the best bar snack in the world. Crispy parsnips with Parmesan cheese. We've come a long way today. We pan-fried, we deep-fat fried, we fried vegetables, we fried fish, and now it's time to call it quits. Make sure that you've turned the fat off, that there's no heat. We don't want to have any catastrophes. And this, if it's clean, can be strained, put in your refrigerator, and used again. We're going to move on. When we come back, we're going to get mixed up in moist heat cooking. We're going to poach some salmon and some other fish. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks a lot.